everyone for joining us tonight. I would like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, whose lands I live and work on, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I'm going to talk for about 15 minutes on one of the books that you mentioned in your very kind introduction, and that's my book that I've written with Dale Liorki of the University of Tampere in Finland on open data practices. And I'm going to share some of the findings that went into the book, so show some snapshots from the interviews that sort of informed that research. But I'll begin by talking a little bit about the background to the project and some of the drivers and motivations for why we did this work. And I'm just going to share my screen. I'll just pop that into presenter view. Okay, so I hope you can all see that and hear me loud and clear. So the story behind this book is an interesting one, and it started as an idea back in 2017, in the early part of 2017, which was when I took a few years out of the academy to go into government and work within an open data program in the state of Victoria. And during the preparation for the interview for this role, I started doing a little bit of research into what open data actually is, or what openness actually means, and how I would sort of apprehend that as a researcher and a theorist, kind of entering the practical kind of world of government. If there's any public servants in the seminar tonight, I'll, quote unquote practical, which I'm sure you sort of understand. So in preparation for sort of making this transition, I started to look at some of the drivers for information openness. And my background is in open access publishing before I was an academic. And I sort of came at this from the naive point of view, with the mindset of information activism and the idea that openness equals transparency. And at around that time, the kind of most common, just advance that slide. At around this time, the most common framing for open data was from the Obama administration, which sort of talks about the idea that, a kind of modernized government approaches its information management in ways that see the release of open data as something that is open by default. All government information should be available freely and in an unrestricted form within the public domain, unless there's good reason for it not to be. And as I sort of started to go deeper into this, the Australian Productivity Commission released its report into data accessibility. And within that report, there's a section that's entitled Access Denied. And it talks about other framings of openness within the context of data sharing and release. And there's these sort of 3 E's that sort of come through that report. And if you search that report, you see these words come up over and over and over again. And that are efficiencies, entrepreneurialism, and evidence bases. And I started to sort of look at these 2 approaches to openness, and started to think about some of the tensions in that. So if you're a data custodian, or if you're working for a government agency or a department that's charged with the responsible data stewardship of government data assets, then these 2 positions, one that holds that transparency is paramount, and the other that sort of looks at these other ways of understanding openness, can be a little bit problematic. And then against that, there's this sort of backdrop of kind of parallel trajectory that sees the digitalization of government services, which translates practices of openness through the kind of free libre open source software movement, which is designed to, bring down the barriers to the production of digital products and services within government. So between those three positions, I started to sort of think about how those tensions might play out in the language and practices that occur within government environments that are sort of dealing with data sharing and release. So we started to sort of look at a project that could potentially look at the kind of translation of, to sort of use the academic jargon, the translation of lexis to praxis, the translation of language to practice. We started to think a little bit about the different areas of impact that get talked about when we talk about openness in government, and that is a sort of collection, maintenance, and sharing, interpretation, analysis, creating and adding value to existing government data sets, and then identifying and anticipating what the risks and potentials associated with releasing data into the public domain might be. So thinking about those three problems, we started to think about ways that broader practices of openness could be understood in the context of data ecosystems that are becoming more complex than existed at the time when open data first became a priority for governments. And if you looked at the quote that I opened this talk with, that's sort of around the 2010, 2013 era. And one of the really interesting things that happened over the sort of course of this research was Cambridge Analytica. The Cambridge Analytica scandal happened. And within our interview findings, we saw the language really change and the attitudes towards risk really changed sort of after that event. And this sort of idea that, that the kind of principles of openness are enshrined in this particular technical and political moment that's sort of, frozen in time is a little naive. And that's something that we wanted to kind of get to the nuance of. The sort of second motivation for this book was to think about the idea of openness against the vision of the public sector beyond 2020, especially in terms of a workforce that's shaping various changes in the way government work is done, and how different career trajectories, different types of backgrounds and experiences that are sort of coming into government, and seeing how that translates out to the ways that open data policies are enacted, or the ways that open data practices evolve. And then the third was looking at open data practices in the context of the increasing demand for public-private partnerships that involve the provision of open data and open data related services. So the book's informed by a kind of background survey that we conducted, a series of 50 semi-structured interviews that were conducted predominantly in Australia, but also including Singapore and London, and then a workshop to start to kind of understand how some of the findings might be received within individual departmental contexts. So working in a government setting allowed us to explore issues in depth and helped us view practices with empathy for a variety of points of view and job-related pressures faced by individuals working within the defined roles, specific responsibilities and performance measures, or on specific projects in various departmental teams. This is a little breakdown of the interviewee categories that we worked with. So we worked with open data publishers, and there's a kind of descriptor and some examples of what those positions were. What we call data custodians, peripheral government workers, and what we call external users or stakeholders. And again, you can see there examples of different job titles that would sit within those particular categories. From that, and I'm sort of building on some more recent research that's been done by others here, but from that we sort of started to look at the different features and patterns of use of open data products and open data portals that were coming through. And we started to look at understanding different usage patterns around how people discover data sets, what reuse and added value and republishing practices look like, how open data was analyzed, evaluated and discussed, and then how requests for new data are handled. Sorry, I'm just moving various things around my screen so that I can get to the controls at the bottom here. So our research was not without contradiction, and we found that, for instance, those who we spoke to were overwhelmingly enthusiastic about open data. However, our interview transcript demonstrate that there's some ambiguities in terms of how this is framed. Open data was perceived to be a valuable public asset, but we found little agreement on what high value data sets might be and how value from published open data sets could be leveraged. We routinely observed a degree of frustration amongst those working on open data initiatives at the barriers that often stood in the way of progress and the lack of champions for open data at sort of amongst the senior leadership of organizational units, but we also saw a range of epistemologically, ideologically, politically, and technically guided perspectives on open data. However, these were not always clearly articulated in a delineated or intersectional manner, which could speak to the different aspects of open data literacy or how these perspectives might form the basis of training on how to read data, how to diagnose or predict some of the ethical, regulatory, or legal ramifications of open data release. The workers we spoke to were often critical of organizational silos and described them as a structural barrier to appropriate fit for release data entering the public domain. Yet those we interviewed also spoke of the organizational units where open data policies and portals were managed as being rightfully isolated and distinct from other areas of the department or agency. We observed that some workers in open data programs viewed data custodians as too conservative, skeptical, or resistant. But we also observed that some open data workers themselves saw the maintenance of conditions which see data release as a priority in the day-to-day information management practices of other agencies as being a priority that deserves more attention. So lots of different kind of tensions and conflicts that came through in the interviews that we conducted. And we tried to look at the expression and language and examples that people used to articulate some of these things. And I'm not going to give too much away because obviously I want people to buy the book. I'm just showing you some snapshots from within some of the interviews and some of the sort of work that happened around this project. And I'll quote one of these, which is one of our interview subjects who we're calling an open data advocate, who said open data isn't something that you can switch on and off like a tap. It's difficult and it won't be done quickly. I think too many people are keen to see new pieces of technology or innovative thinking just being used for the sake of using it. I'm just going to skip through some of this, but just in the interest of time, But the kind of point of this slide is that a lot of the interviews that we did were sort of discussing how different agencies and departments enact and implement policies around open data that sort of come from above and have these principles sort of coded within them. And the example on the slide here is from the Victorian government, where a lot of our work was conducted, and the sort of principles within the policy state that government data will be made available unless access is restricted for reasons of privacy, public safety, security, law enforcement, public health, and compliance with the law. Government data will be made available under flexible licensing. With exceptions, government data will be made available at no or minimal cost. Government data will be easy to find, i.e. discoverable, and accessible in formats that promote its reuse. And then finally, government will follow standards and guidelines relating to the release of data and agency accountability for that data release. And nearly everyone we spoke to could give us examples of how practices kind of get lost in translation. And quite readily our interview subjects would tell us about instances where certain exclusion criteria would apply that sort of don't fit within the policy, and then compliance becomes a kind of contestable issue. I'm just going to skip over some of these. So the disjuncture between policy vision and practice of open data impacts users, and many of our interviewees and survey respondents expressed a desire to move away from the delivery of open data to users through a one-way pipeline, and favoured a stronger partnership between publishers and users, driven by a desire to solve specific problems rather than releasing data in the hope that it will result in an instantly successful app or product. So the book sort of concludes with 5 kind of key recommendations, and I'll sort of summarize them here. So the first of those is for the sort of successful future practice of open data. The first principle is bringing together different understandings of what openness means in the context of contemporary data ecosystems, and finding ways to express this in a language that's both coherent with the way that, in the ways that government policy is written, and that makes sense to non-governmental actors and citizens. So there's a typo on that slide. I think I accidentally pressed my backspace and deleted a couple of characters there. The second is rethinking the position of open by default, and acknowledge that open data releases occur in an increasingly risky and complex environment where the de-identified data may be re-identified, and data use will not always be in the best interest of data custodians or citizens. Third, investing in programs that foster the development of sophisticated and multifaceted data literacies at multiple levels of the public service, which includes sustained discourse between those working with the philosophical and conceptual aspects of data release, like us, and those at the kind of technical and policy level. The fourth, exploring ways that the vast reuses of open data can be captured, documented, and republished as a means of demonstrating value, potential, limitations, and return on investment associated with open data publishing by government agencies. And finally, approaching the development of open government data portals with an attention to the provision of user-centric open source software as a service that can foster and enable greater use greater user engagement and incorporation of enriched data that arises from open government data reuse. So as I said, this is a very quick run through a much deeper project that was conducted over a number of years, which will be published in a couple of months. I think it's September that, that the book will come out, and that'll come out through Palgrave. And that's me. So thank you for taking the time to listen to my talk, and I thank you for your work in the data governance and data stewardship community at large.